Why don't we time travel and why don't we go way back to about 1910 and start there? And we're going to weave our way through history.
Jump in at any point where you want us to dive into a new era and how it impacted this crisis for our disappearing farms. But when you go back to 1910, what that really boils down to is that was actually very briefly a golden age of agriculture. And it was, however, headed toward crisis. So when I say golden age, that was a time period where you had a lot more farms sprouting up all over the country. Farming was an entrepreneurial venture. This was the years of my great grandpa Alice, who traveled from Bavaria to America to try to dig a better living out of the dirt. And he and so many others did that. And there were farms sprouting up all over the country to try to capitalize on the new economic opportunity of trying to feed this vast country and much of the world. And when we headed into World War I, there was a lot of expectation that the North American continent was going to have to feed a smoldering Europe after World War I. And so there was a lot of ramp up of food production. And there was an expectation that we were going to be feeding Europe. And what happened is Europe actually recovered from World War I a lot faster than anybody expected. It was this apocalyptic war. Nobody had ever seen war with terror and death on that level before. And Europe got back up from it quicker than we thought they would. And so there was suddenly dropping demand for agricultural products coming out of America. And that became a real problem because as those prices fell, kicked off a banking crisis that is very similar to what we saw during the Great Recession more recently here. The farmers suddenly couldn't pay their loans because they were not making what they used to make anywhere close to on their crops. And that put the banks in trouble and the banks started struggling. Once the banks and the farmers were struggling, that spread to other banks and other farmers. And it kicked off a rural financial crisis that actually resulted in a rural financial crisis and agricultural depression that began 10 years before the Great Depression. So when the Great Depression hit Black Thursday in 1929 and the whole, globe was pushed into global depression, that was 10 years after farmers in rural areas had been suffering and been knocked on their back. And so when you look back in 1910 and 1914 is that golden era when the prices were really balanced. What farmers were getting for what they were producing was really in balance. It was working. We were headed into this strong period during World War I when everyone thought America's going to feed the world, and then the collapse. And we began losing farms in that time period, and with few interruptions, we've continued losing farms ever since.